Hi everyone, I'm Yasha, and welcome to the 34th episode of Election Scoop. And today we'll be wrapping up the second part in a two-part series about midterms being held in states that start with the letter M. This episode will be covering Minnesota, Missouri, Mississippi, and Montana. Apparently, politicians like to name their states in words that begin with M. Who am I to judge? Let's get started. First off is the race for Minnesota's governor. Congressman Tim Walz, a Democrat, is running against Republican Jeff Johnson. Now, Minnesota is an interesting state. It backed Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election by less than 1%, but it's considerably more Democratic, although not overwhelmingly so, when it comes to local races, House, Governor, Senate. And you can see that by the fact that Walz has a pretty comfortable lead in the polls. Not huge, but enough that we would rate this race tilt Democrat, going on maybe even likely Democrat, just because we're not seeing much of an upset here. Now, Minnesota is also holding elections for Senate, but if you'll recall, Senator Al Franken's resignation from the Senate, because he was a senator from Minnesota, means that this seat, seat 1, is going to be holding an election, but his seat, Franken's seat, seat 2, will also be holding a special election for that seat. So both senators, both Senate seats, I guess, from Minnesota are up for re-election. So incumbent Democrat Amy Klobuchar is running for re-election against Republican Jim Newberger. And as I said, Minnesota swing at the national level, but at the Senate level, it's especially in this race, it's very Democratic. Amy Klobuchar is extremely popular. Last election cycle, she won re-election. I think she lost 2 counties out of the roughly somewhere around 100 counties that Minnesota has. Very popular, safe seat, no chance of an upset here. Second district, the incumbent Democratic Senator Tina Smith, who is the temporary replacement for Franken, is now running for, I guess, technically re-election, but to a first full term, against Republican Karen Housley. This race is a little closer because Smith doesn't really have the incumbency advantage that Klobuchar does, but she has a pretty comfortable lead in the polls, and we rate this race as likely Democratic because it doesn't look like there's much room for a change as it now stands. Minnesota's House. If you'll notice, only districts 4, 5, and 6 are safe Republican or safe Democratic. District 1 is held by the Democrats, but is a complete toss-up. It could go either way. Districts 2 and 3 are held by Republicans, but we expect them to actually flip and go for the Democrats. District 7 is held by the Democrats, and it will probably be held by the Democrats again, but there's a possibility that it will go red. And District 8 is held by the Democrats, but we expect there's actually a really good chance, not just a 55, 51% chance, but a very likely chance that it will flip hands and go for the Republicans. So if you're keeping track, that's most likely nothing's going to happen, or Democrats are going to gain 1 net, but Republicans could gain, hypothetically, anywhere up to 3, and Democrats, likewise, could hypothetically gain anything up to 3. So we leave Minnesota and go down south to Mississippi, which is actually another state. I believe it's the only other state that's holding elections for both of its Senate seats. So the same for the same reasons described before. Democrat David Beria is running against incumbent Republican Roger Wicker. And Mississippi, unfortunately for the Democrats, unfortunately for the Republicans, is not as Democratic as Minnesota, even though on the local level, it's complicated. We won't get into that. This race is safer. And the second race, where former Congressman Mike Espy, who was congressman in, like the 80s and 90s, and the temporary incumbent Republican Cindy Hyde Smith are facing off. This race is a little closer, and as a matter of fact, because it's a special election, it's top two. So if no one gets 50%, they go to a runoff because there are other candidates running. But in the runoff, polls show that it should be a pretty safe race for the Republican. So we're rating this as likely R. SB can catch up. There's room for him to do that, but it's not very likely. Mississippi's House, no news. Missouri now. Missouri Senate. Now this is a photo finish race. Democrat Claire McCaskill is running for re-election against Republican Josh Hawley in a race that President Trump did very well in and is now a dead heat in the polls. Now this is one of the most famous, most spent on high-profile cases in the entire U.S. this year. Most polls actually have it at a dead tie. Like the average is a tie, whether it's 46-46 or 47-47. Some polls have Hawley leading by 1 or 2. Some polls have McCaskill leading by 1 or 2. The point is, this is a total toss-up, and control for the Senate, the entire Senate, could very well be decided by a few hundred or a few thousand voters here in Missouri. Missouri's House, on the other hand, is not as competitive. The 2nd District, which is held by Republicans, has some chance of going for the Democrats, but it's very unlikely, and so most likely there'll be no change. Last state for today is Montana. Kind of similar to what's going on in Missouri, but less talked about. Incumbent Democrat Jon Tester is running for re-election against Republican Matt Rosendale. Now, Montana is another state that President Trump did very well in. It's not a swing state, really. At the federal level, at the presidential level, Democrats usually don't stand a great chance of winning Montana. But there's a Democratic governor who's not up for re-election this year, and as you can see, a Democratic senator in Jon Tester, who does have a small but visible lead in the polls, and we rate this race as tilt Democratic. It's leaning towards the Democrats, but it is anyone's race. Last but not least, the Montana House. Now, these rural states are very lucky in that there's only one House district, so they get their own slide. Ooh, fancy. Greg Gianforte, the Republican incumbent who actually won a special re-election when last year's elected representative, Ryan Zinke, resigned to take a position in the Trump administration, he is now running against Democrat Kathleen Williams. Now, this race, again, is close, but kind of a mirror image of the Senate race. We can see that it's tilting R. Gianforte has a visible lead in the polls. So, that's the spiel about the races that are going on in the M states, parts 1 and 2. And we'll be back soon with coverage, with predictions on the rest of the United States that we have not done so far. So thanks for watching, and remember, don't forget to vote.